Hey there, beautiful Connor, and welcome to the video. As you could tell from the title of the video, you could probably guess that in this video I'm going to be talking about different frame rates and shutter speeds that go with said frame rates. Now, if you don't know, in digital cameras, the shutter speed does matter when you're shooting video, like in stills photography. The shutter speed will determine how much motion blur in each frame that is exposed because a certain amount of light is being processed by the sensor. So if you move while it's being processed, that's where you get motion blur from. Now, in the olden days, when we had film cameras, the way they controlled this was with basically a circular wheel that would spin around, and it was basically half of it was cut out. And this is where we get what's called the 180-degree rule, because half of a circle, which is 360, is 180. It would only expose each like little box of a film for basically half of whatever the frame rate is. So they shot in 24 frames a second, so it would have to be exposed for 1/48th of a second. They did that, of course, because, well, film was expensive, so they settled on 24, so they didn't have to spend as much for shooting, and because you're shooting at such a lower frame rate, they needed a way to reduce the amount of motion blur because if each box was exposed for the full 1/24th of a second, you'd get a lot of motion blur because, again, whenever you're moving, the light is going to get into the sensor and a slower shutter speed will give you more motion blur. In today's world, when people think of film or a cinematic look, people generally will refer to 24 frames a second because frame rate is familiar and we're accustomed to it. However, nowadays, with more powerful digital cameras, we're able to achieve much higher frame rates. And of course, people being, accustomed to doing 180 degrees, people, if they're shooting 30, they do 1/60th of a second. If they're shooting 60 frames, they do 1/20th of a second, which is an incredibly short amount of time, which is why shooting with those higher shutter speeds, it's harder to light because you need more light because the sensor is being exposed to less light. It's kind of similar to photography. You need more light for a shorter shutter speed. Now, of course, there are a lot of people that, they have different shutter speeds for different creative purposes. For example, a higher shutter speed will give you less motion blur, so it tends to look more intense. Like if you want to shoot like a handheld shot or two people like fighting or whatever, you're getting less motion blur and it looks more intense. For example, I have a video here which is 30 frames a second. However, it's shot with 1/20th of a second shutter speed. If I pause on when I'm moving my hand, I'm not getting a lot of motion blur, which is probably why it looks more intense. It feels weird, basically. And then, of course, there's also shooting at 360 degrees, where sensor is being exposed for the entire duration of a frame. And for example, here I have 30 frames a second shot at 1/30th of a second. There is a lot of motion blur. If I pause when I'm moving my hand, it's completely blurred. Also, one of the benefits of shooting in a faster shutter speed is that because you get less motion blur, it can be very useful for keying. Like if you have a subject in front of like a green screen, you don't actually want a lot of motion blur because then whatever you're doing to key, you'll have more issues with it. So having as little motion blur as possible in that scenario is very beneficial. I am shooting this at 60 frames a second. I should be shooting at 1/20th of a second shutter speed, right? Well, I'm not. Could you tell? Can you tell? Can you tell, huh? Whenever I shoot 60 frames a second, unless I'm specifically shooting something that is moving really fast, I generally shoot with a 360 shutter angle. Why? Well, it gives me better exposure, and I feel like it actually looks more natural. Here I have a video of me shooting 60 FPS at 1/20th of a second. It looks more fluid because of the more frames you have. And you can see there's not a lot of motion blur. And a lot of people think this looks too robotic, or they say it feels unnatural. Really, what you have to blame for that is not necessarily the frame rate, but the shutter speed. Of course, frame rate does matter. However, the amount of motion blur you're getting in an image can definitely greatly affect the feel. For example, let me go back to 30 FPS at 1/60th of a second. You can see that the amount of motion blur you're getting might look a little more natural. This is 60 FPS at 1/60th of a second. 360-degree shutter angle. Personally, I actually really like to shoot this. The reason being is that you get the benefit of the extra fluidity of 60 frames a second. However, it feels more natural and less robotic than shooting at 1/20th of a second because you are getting more motion blur. By all means, you should be getting the same amount of motion blur as if you're shooting 30 frames a second with 1/60th of the shutter speed. I see a lot of people just saying that anything other than 24 frames a second at 1/48th shutter speed is garbage. I really don't like when people say that because it's almost pompous sounding. I'm not saying that shooting in 24 FPS is bad. Really, I'm just trying to argue for other frame rates rather than against any specific type of frame rate. Like I said, me personally, I like shooting 60 FPS at 1/60th of a second because it feels more fluid, it feels more realistic due to the extra frames, but it also feels a little more natural and less robotic than shooting at 60 FPS at 1/20th of a second. Right now, I am shooting my camera at 60 frames a second and 1/60th of a second. And I don't know. Maybe you think it looks weird, but personally, I've played all these videos. The type and the amount of motion blur, I feel, has a greater impact on the overall look and feel of the footage or the video than the actual frames a second. The frames per second do matter. You're getting more visual information because you're shooting at a higher frame rate, which is probably why it looks more fluid, but you're getting the same amount of motion blur. It's just more frames. I hope I'm doing a good enough job at, getting my message across. There's nothing wrong with 24 frames a second. It's just, I really don't like when I see a lot of people saying that anything other than 24 frames a second is garbage. I completely disagree with that. Not even talking about video games, that's a totally different thing. I'm just talking about video. A lot of people I know still, they swear by 24 at 1/48th or 1/50th technically, and I don't have any problems with that, but I actually prefer 60 FPS at 1/60th of a second. Really, I don't care that much, actually. When I'm watching a video, I don't ultimately judge it off of 24, 30, 60. I don't really actually care all that much. It's just my choice is 60 at 1/60th because personally, that's my preference. But I'm tired of a lot of other people kind of being pompous and really stuck up about only 24 frames a second. I've seen so many videos of people saying, "Ooh, top 10 mistakes beginning filmmakers make," and always, they say 24 frames a second only. First of all, do I disagree in saying that it's the only way to get a cinematic look? Because there's so many more things that go into it. Also, it kind of goes against, really, a person filming, because it can be considered a form of art. And as far as artistic expression, that can be subjective from person to person. Just because your preference is a certain thing doesn't mean it's the only way other people can create the content. If a person who is telling a story or expressing themselves through film and they're shooting at 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second, it doesn't suddenly become an invalid piece of work just because you only like 24 frames a second. I'm not really a filmmaker or a cinematographer or anything like that. Artistic expression is something that should be left to the creator. If they want to make something a certain way, if they're going for a certain look, a certain aesthetic, then their work doesn't become worthless just because you don't like it. If someone likes something, if they like a certain aesthetic, then there's nothing wrong with them using it. Now, they might not appeal to a larger audience, but that doesn't suddenly mean that the minority of people that like that have bad taste. That's all I wanted to say for this video. Again, I hope I was able to get my message across clearly and concisely. I'm not very good with words or explaining things, but with all that being said, I am finished with this video. Thanks for watching. I hope this could be helpful to anyone. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time you see me. Bye.